Welcome to Words to Live By, a podcast series hosted by the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Each week, we will share some of the wit and wisdom of Ronald Reagan. In essence, Words to Live By, made up of radio addresses and speeches he delivered from the 1960s through the 1980s. 80 years ago, in August 1944, the Polish Home Army, also known as the AK, they mobilized a massive non-communist resistance movement. The plan, which actually began in 1943, was called Operation Tempest. They initiated the Warsaw Uprising with the intent of liberating the city from German occupation. At the time, the exiled Polish government operated from a base in London. Maybe you didn't know this. And that government made a last-minute decision to begin an armed uprising in the Polish capital on July 31st, 1944. Well, what does that have to do with Ronald Reagan, you ask? Okay, so 40 years ago, President Reagan hosted a special luncheon at the White House in honor of this historic Polish uprising. He invited many remaining members of the Polish Army, along with His Eminence John Cardinal Kroll, Archbishop of Philadelphia, and Stefan Karbonski, who was the chairman of the Warsaw Uprising Commemorative Executive Committee. We'll focus on this fascinating speech in this podcast. But first, back to a little background for you on the Warsaw Uprising. Do you recall the main goals? Well, in addition to liberating the country from occupying German forces, they wanted to legitimize the exiled Polish government and present Poland as a country on equal footing with the USSR before a Soviet-backed regime could be installed. It wasn't just an attempt to get rid of the Nazis. It was also an attempt to reestablish the Polish government separate from the Soviets. Sounds like, at the time, they actually trusted the Soviets. To completely eliminate German control in Warsaw, however, the Polish army needed Soviet military support, and yeah, that's where it gets tricky, which meant the timing of the operation had to coincide with the arrival of the Red Army in Warsaw and the retreat of German forces from the city. On July 27, 1944, the First Polish Army, which had been incorporated into the Red Army earlier that year, was only 30 miles south of Warsaw. 2 days later, the Soviet commanding officer ordered the tanks of his Second Army to probe German defenses outside of Warsaw. As the First Company broke through German defenses and entered the outskirts of Warsaw's eastern suburb, the leaders of the Polish resistance made the decisive move to begin an armed insurrection in the Polish capital. The Warsaw Uprising, which officially began on August 1st, 1944, lasted until October 2nd, 1944. It was a major military endeavor of the Polish resistance movement during World War II. And from the beginning, civilians were embroiled in the 63-day conflict, enduring relentless airstrikes and the resulting fires that forced them from their homes. They were also working to procure arms, provide supplies for insurgents, erect defensive barriers, extinguish fires, and carry messages underground. Sadly, as the Soviets halted their offensive, which to this point had been a success, Nazi units had time to regroup and to reorganize a counteroffensive, forcing the armed insurrection to hold out much longer than originally planned. Civilians were initially in favor of the uprising since they believed, as did the AK, that the fighting would last only a few days. As the unrest raged on and on, Warsaw received little help from the Soviets, and civilian support continued to diminish, leading to tensions between the AK, or the Polish Army, and the population of Warsaw. Remember, in 1984, the Polish people were again fighting for their freedom, this time from the Soviets, a struggle that the president addresses in this speech. So now, let's listen to the president.
Your Eminence, members of the Polish Home Army, members of the Polish-American Congress, distinguished guests, Dzień dobry. I am, however, delighted that we're all here today and together for this important commemoration. It's always an honor for me to be with individuals like yourselves who understand the value of freedom. I'm reminded of a story about a conversation between one of our citizens and a Soviet citizen. The American described the freedom of speech that we have here in the United States, and the citizen of the Soviet Union said, well, we're free to speak in the Soviet Union just like you are in the United States. He said, the only difference is you're free after you speak. But today, we pay tribute to a nation which for 2 centuries has struggled for freedom and independence. From the uprisings in 1794, the November uprising in 1830, and then again in 1863, the people of Poland demonstrated courage and a commitment to human liberty that inspired free men and women everywhere. And this 200-year record of perseverance and bravery coincided with the development of our own precious liberty here in the United States, and that is no mere coincidence. Our 2 peoples drank from the same well of freedom, held dear the same Judeo-Christian values, respected the simple virtues of honesty and hard work. And even today, it's often noted that, unlike many others, our 2 peoples take their religious convictions seriously. These heartfelt convictions have kept the spirit of freedom burning in our hearts, especially during times of great adversity. Pope John Paul II has said, freedom is given to man by God as a measure of his dignity. And as children of God, he said, we cannot be slaves. Well, I know that you feel as I do. We're truly blessed in this time of great need to have a spiritual leader like Pope John Paul II. The continuing suppression of the Polish national identity brought wave after wave of Polish immigrants to the United States. And for that, we can be grateful. We all know the list of contributions and the names of those who rose to great prominence. But just as important are the millions who came here and with their hard work and with their moral strength helped shape the American character. During this century, Americans and Poles have stood side by side in those 2 conflagrations that swept the world. The First World War, unfortunately, did not end all wars, but it did result in the reestablishment of the Polish state. This month, we commemorate a desperate battle of the Second World War, an heroic attempt by free Poles to liberate their country from the heel of Nazi occupation and to protect it from post-war foreign domination. For years, they covertly resisted the occupation forces. And then in 1944, for 63 brutal and agonizing days, ill-equipped and overwhelmingly outnumbered, they, and I could say many of you, held off the Nazi war machine. And it's fitting that we and all free people take special care to remember this occasion. Of those who fought for freedom, of those who put their lives on the line for human liberty, I can think of none who should be prouder than those who can say, I fought in the Polish Home Army. And today we honor 3 individuals, heroes of the Polish Home Army, never given their due after the Allied victory. And it's my great honor to now present the Legion of Merit to the families of or representatives of these men. So let us salute Stefan Rozvetsky, who led the resistance until he was captured and executed by the Gestapo.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, his son will arise, the son of Bor Komorowski, leader of the Warsaw Uprising, who later died in near poverty and exile in London. And finally, General Leopold Ukalitsky, who was lured into a trap and died under suspicious circumstances in Moscow. These brave men and the courageous individuals who fought under their command represent the best of the human spirit. They risked all for their ideals, for their God and country at a time when the odds were so much against them. They are now part of the inspiring legacy of the Polish people.
More from the President and American loyalty to Poland right after this brief message.
The Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation is the nonprofit organization created by President Reagan himself, and specifically charged by him with continuing his legacy and sharing his principles: individual liberty, economic opportunity, global democracy, and national pride. We must remain vigilant and work together to share these conservative principles with younger generations. Your role is critical to move our mission forward. Thank you for your continued support. Please visit reaganfoundation.org/give. That's reaganfoundation.org/give.
Now, back to the President's speech, where he reiterates America's dedication to help the people of Poland. As far as the Warsaw Uprising was concerned, the Polish army did not inform the people of Warsaw about the uprising. So many citizens became trapped in the chaos that defined those first few days of the insurrection. Those attempting to return home from work were cut off, separated from their families, with no way to contact their loved ones. Children were left abandoned when their parents were unable to return home or were killed. An untold number of people caught in the crossfire were killed, their bodies left in the streets to be covered by dust and debris from exploding buildings. Everyone became a soldier: women, children, any able-bodied citizen. Approximately 45,000 members of the Polish army joined the combat. They were supported by 2,500 soldiers from other resistance movements, yet only a quarter of the partisans had access to weapons. And they were fighting against 25,000 German soldiers equipped with artillery, tanks, and air forces. Just imagine. Towards the end of September 1944, German forces took control over Warsaw, systematically destroying most of the city right to the ground. On October 2nd, 1944, the uprising ended. The number of victims exceeded 180,000. Soviet troops resumed their offensive much later, taking over devastated Warsaw on January 17th, 1945. During the uprising, the Red Army occupied a suburb of Warsaw, but made no efforts to aid the Polish rebels. The Soviets also rejected a request by the British to use Soviet air bases to airlift supplies to the suffering Poles. After 63 days, the Poles, out of arms, supplies, food, water, they were forced to surrender. And in the aftermath, the Nazis deported much of Warsaw's population, destroyed the city, and with protesters in Warsaw out of the way, well, the Soviets faced little organized opposition in establishing a communist government in Poland. Let's listen to the President.
If there's a lesson to be learned from the history books, it is that Poland may be beaten down, but it is never defeated. It may be forced in submission, but it will never give up. It may be pressured to acquiesce, but it will never accept foreign domination and the suppression of God-given freedom. After 2 decades of brutal foreign domination, we witnessed just a short time ago, a resurrection of the indomitable spirit of the Polish people. And I assure you, we have not forgotten and will never forget solidarity and the freedom of the Polish people. There are some, of course, who seem all too willing to turn a blind eye to Soviet transgressions, ostensibly to improve the dialogue between East and West. But those who condemn firm support for freedom and democracy, who in order to prove their sincerity would project weakness, are no friends of peace, human liberty, or meaningful dialogue. Our policies toward Poland and other captive nations are based upon a set of well-established principles. First, let me state emphatically that we reject any interpretation of the Yalta Agreement that suggests American consent for the division of Europe into spheres of influence. On the contrary, we see that agreement as a pledge by the three great powers to restore full independence and to allow free and democratic elections in all countries liberated from the Nazis after World War II. And there is no reason to absolve the Soviet Union or ourselves from this commitment. We shall continue to press for full compliance with it and with the Charter of the United Nations, the Helsinki Final Act, and other international agreements guaranteeing fundamental human rights. Passively accepting the permanent subjugation of the people of Eastern Europe is not an acceptable alternative. In 1981, when it appeared that Poland would suffer a similar fate to that of Hungary in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968, we raised our voices in support of the Polish people. And we did not remain passive when, under intense Soviet pressure, martial law was imposed on them. Perhaps the most significant thing that we can do is let the Polish people and all the people of Eastern Europe know that they're not forgotten. And that's why we're modernizing Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the Voice of America. Our radio programming is becoming the mighty force for good that it was intended to be. As the scriptures say, know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Well, our broadcast will carry the truth to captive people throughout the world. The free peoples of the world are in ideological competition with the followers of a doctrine that rejects the basic tenets of freedom and declares the worship of God to be a social evil. As important as this competition is, until recently the democracies, including the United States, seemed paralyzed by uncertainty and lacking the will to compete. In the last 3.5 years, we've quit apologizing, and at long last, we're standing up and being counted. As our United Nations ambassador, Jean Kirkpatrick, said, we've taken off our "kick me" sign. We're proud of our way of life. We're confident that freedom will prevail because it works and because it is right. We believe the free peoples of the world should support all those who share our democratic values. And the rise of solidarity is a matter of historic significance. It continues to be an inspiration to all free people that the Marxist-Leninist myth of inevitability is crumbling. Communism has brought with it only deprivation and tyranny. What happened in Poland is one sign that the tide is turning. The Polish people, with their courage and perseverance, will lead the way to freedom and independence, not only for themselves, but for all those who yearn to breathe free. The battle cry of the Polish Home Army still rings true. Poland is fighting, Poland will live, Poland will overcome. Thank you all for being here today, and God bless you.
Thank you for listening. For more information on the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, including information on how to become a member, information on upcoming exhibits at the Reagan Library, and more information on the legacy of President Reagan, please visit reaganfoundation.org. And don't forget to like and follow the Reagan Foundation on all social media platforms.
Don't forget to subscribe to the Words to Live By podcast in your iTunes or Google Play stores and on other podcast platforms as they become available. New episodes of Words to Live By come out every Tuesday. Like what you hear? Check out our A Reagan Forum podcast featuring great speeches delivered at the Reagan Library. New episodes drop every Thursday. And don't forget to follow @Ronald Reagan on Facebook, @Ronald Reagan 40 on Twitter, and Reagan Foundation on YouTube. Also, search for us on SoundCloud and Stitcher.